What's going on, everyone? Welcome back to the Muscle Memoirs Podcast. I am your host, Mike Murray, and in this episode, I discuss the most recent controversy in the evidence based fitness community, the P ratio, with none other than Lyle McDonald. This conversation took place a few weeks ago and followed our discussion on how hard should you train. If you have not already checked out this two-part series, I strongly encourage you to do so. Prior to this chat, Lyle wasn't familiar with the specific points put forth in the debate between the Stronger by Science team and Menno Henselman's, so I spent a few minutes catching him up to speed, and then we jumped into his current thoughts on the P ratio, as well as some concerns with the articles from the aforementioned parties. Do high body fat levels impair P ratios? Do lean individuals gain a higher proportion of muscle mass with increases in body weight? Stay tuned to find out Lyle's current thoughts on the topics. Lyle, you probably wrote the first article on the P ratio. I'm not sure if your position has updated since, but tell the listeners what comes to mind. What are your thoughts on the P ratio? Does it matter for bodybuilders? Should we try to stay lean in the off season? Can we let ourselves go and do a dirty bulk? Could that be beneficial?
Okay, so let's first, so people we're on the same page. What is the P ratio? P ratio, the P stands for protein. And what it is, well, I'm going to simplify it. What it technically is the ratio of energy put into the body as protein versus the total body energy gain, which is a super complicated way of thinking about it. Think about it in terms of the proportion of muscle gained or lost relative to the proportion of fat gained or lost. It's not exactly accurate, but it's close enough for what we're going to discuss. So all of this work comes from Gilbert Forbes. He's the one who wrote endless papers and books. The guy was obsessed with body composition. Good God almighty, that's all he wrote about for 30 some odd years. And I once photocopied an entirety of one of his books because, yeah, I'm not obsessive at all. And here's basically what he found. You got to realize that what he was looking at had to do with some of the starvation studies, Minnesota, a lot of the early fasting studies. And basically what he found was several things. One, the more body fat you have, the less muscle you lose when you lose weight. Similarly, the more body fat you have, right? So that means basically high body fat, low P ratio. There's a lot of fat without losing a lot of muscle. Similarly, the more body fat you have, the less muscle you gain when you gain weight. Still a low P ratio. Now, the opposite extreme, the leaner you are, the higher the P ratio, in sense of the more fat you lose, well, you lose, of the weight that you lose, a greater proportion is muscle. And similarly, when you're lean, same high P ratio, that when you gain weight, you gain a higher proportion of muscle, right? And for years, what was stated was that while there were differences between individuals in P ratio, like you and I might have a difference, that within any given individual, it was consistent. Which basically would say that, okay, if I lose weight, I'm going to lose at this proportion. When I regain weight, I'm going to regain, I'm going to end up right where I started. So, and that was debated forever. There were so many letters to the editor arguing different sides of this. Now you have to keep in mind what his study base was, which was, again, it was a lot of starvation, dieting studies. He found other things. One of the things he found, and this still kicks around, was that when you were dieting, the lower your calories, the larger proportion of muscle loss. And I will address that because I've addressed that on my website. And it's true-ish within the context of what they did because they didn't think of what they were doing. Now, let's address the muscle loss thing first, right? And actually, it'd be interesting. They should have gotten Eric Helms on that podcast and that debate, and here's why. He wrote a review paper that, interestingly, Menno dismissed out of hand, which is odd given what he's saying, that basically looking at the limited data said, well, the leaner you get, the more protein you need to stave off muscle loss. That's exactly what this is saying. And we know the biology of it, right? As you get leaner and there's less fat, because that's kind of what it comes down to. When you're losing, this is easier. The more fat you have to lose, the more fat your body uses for fuel. more fat you have, the less protein it needs to break down for fuel needs. As you get leaner, body fat, there's less of it. It's harder to mobilize. The body needs energy, it tends to break down more protein. That's what protein requirements go up as you get leaner. There's another, and a lot of it's hormonal too, right? You've got these changes in leptin, testosterone, cortisol, like natural bodybuilders at 4% or castrate testosterone levels, all this stuff going on. And there's actually a really interesting, here's a trivial tidbit for today. The body is actually trying to, because if you lose all your fat, you don't die. But your body, if you lose too much lean muscle tissue, you do die. What it is actually trying to do is have you run out of fat and run out of lean muscle tissue at the same time, because this will prolong survival under starvation conditions as long as humanly possible. So if you lose all your fat, you start to just hemorrhage lean body mass. So it's trying to actually that's why it's going on. So I think in the fat loss perspective, there's no argument about it, with one caveat. The studies that Forbes was originally looking at didn't use resistance training, didn't have sufficient protein. Now, I read a review paper years ago that I've been unable to find since then. For 20 years I've looked and I cannot find it again. And it was looking at this in sort of an oblique way, because we know that with dieters, right, they put them on a diet and they lose them and they regain, they kind of, especially fatter. And there's another interesting bit I'll talk about that with lean dieters. They end up where they started. And what it said, we followed this one female dieter through endless diet studies. What a horrible life, because she kept losing and regaining. And in this throwaway sentence they didn't follow up on, they said the one study, and she would lose and regain right back to where she started, said the one time we didn't see that was when there was a higher protein intake and intense exercise. I'm like, guys, you had it. You had the answer and you missed it. I could have hallucinated this paper. It wouldn't be the first time, but I remember it very vividly. But we know that of all the things, genetics outside of steroids, heavy resistance training and protein is the single factor that can impact this. Now, one quick detour. Forbes said, the lower your calories, the more muscle you lose. Well, this is true, but what they were doing was giving people 300 calories a day, of which half was protein. That's 40 grams of protein per day. It wasn't the low calories. It was because below a certain calorie intake, protein intake cannot be high enough. That's why my rapid fat loss, plug, is not based around calories. It's based around your protein requirements. The calories come out where they belong. So I think his observation was true, but it was the reasoning. It wasn't the reason. As long as you have sufficient protein and weight training, the body will happily use fat. And there's no interesting tidbit about the weight loss thing. People talk about, you end up fatter than you started. That actually doesn't happen in obese individuals. They lose very little muscle when they diet and they regain what little they lost. Who it happens in is lean individuals. There's a paper by, I don't remember, but it basically points out, because there's a group of lean dieters. By lean, we're talking relatively so. When they diet, because of the way P ratio works, because of the hormones, they lose a significant amount of lean body mass. Like the Minnesota study is a good example. They hemorrhage muscle. They lost like 50% lean body mass of the total weight loss. But when they regain, they don't regain the muscle as quickly. And since losing muscle increases appetite, they get a body fat overshoot when they don't get sufficient protein resistance training. Because when they do that, it doesn't happen. So the P ratio is clearly operating under some level in that. Another interesting example, women on a diet don't lose as much muscle as men. Now, there's a couple reasons. One, estrogen promotes fat mobilization. Give men an estrogen patch, they burn more fat during aerobics. I'm convinced that one of the reasons testosterone spares muscle on a diet is due to its conversion to estrogen. Different topic. But women are also, a man at 12% is equivalent to a woman at 24%. A man at 24% would have effectively the same P ratio as the woman. It's because their body fat's higher, on top of some physiology, but that's a pretty. So I think that there's now, but what about gaining? So again, the early data said, the P ratio was the same in either direction for any given individual. And that's true if all you're looking at is dieting and changing calorie intake. Resistance training is the single greatest impact on partitioning we have, short of drugs. Dietary protein is second. And when you add those things, we know that the system changes completely. So first I'm gonna look at one. So one of the misconceptions that came out of the P ratio data was, oh, well, leaner individuals gain more muscle. Lean out first before you gain, and you'll gain more muscle. And that's not true. What Forbes found, he's dead now. What Forbes found was, if you're naturally lean and you gain weight, you gain more muscle. Because what do we know? When you diet down to leanness, every system in the body is primed to fat gain. So that misconception very much, which doesn't mean there's not a reason to get leaner, but it's not for that reason. And I don't know if that was what Mena was arguing, although I will say that the database he's said he's using is totally irrelevant. Shocking. Although I don't know that I buy that collegiate football studies are particularly relevant either. Because I would argue, well, if you're looking at the linemen versus the cornerbacks, you're looking at different genetic profiles. You're possibly looking at different steroid profiles. Analyze the volume studies that have been done. Analyze the actual training interventions, not using collegiate athletes, which again is not to say, because yeah, is it necessarily that a higher body fat percentage will limit muscle gain? And I think I probably did propose that was 20 some odd years ago. And I basically, yeah, you become insulin resistant, but as much as anything, I do think the fat gain starts to become disproportionate. And I don't know what the body fat percentage range on these football players were. I mean, again, they were going in and doing a data analysis within what the data provided. And that's always, again, we're looking at average body fats. And again, I'm not dismissing what they said. I'm not playing that game, but I don't know. You'd have to, I think, look at a training intervention and maybe they were, but who's taking collegiate football players and trying to gain muscle mass? I'd be curious what the references are. Neither here nor there. So, but that's more of a calorie issue. Will you gain less muscle if you're fatter? There is research, people who are diabetic, who are insulin resistant, that certainly that impairs muscular physiology in terms of muscle protein synthesis. Certainly when you get older, that happens. You develop anabolic resistance, but that's an aging thing, which is why I don't think that that's a particularly good model for, say, a 24-year-old lifter. Certainly, excess body fat, we do know absolutely you do get systemic insulin resistance due to all of the adipokines that are being released. Then we might ask, does regular training overcome that? And that's probably something I would consider a little more, there's also been several recent analyses of Gilbert Forbes' work by people whose name I can't remember offhand. That's basically like, yeah, we've gone back and reanalyzed it, and they don't believe it very much either, at least not in the way he presented. I think they've built a more complex model of it, and I haven't read those papers for a while, so I can't comment. But I do think, yeah, when we add the training and the protein intake, we are looking at a completely different system than what they were originally looking at. Will regular training overcome the insulin resistance inherent to carrying excess body fat? Maybe. Is the inflammation, the chronic inflammation from carrying excess body fat? Yeah, but does anybody really look to see if that's occurring in fat athletes? I don't know.
Yeah.
Because yes, obesity is a chronic inflammatory condition. That is absolutely true. If you're sedentary and overweight. Is that true in highly active athletes? I don't frankly know. I don't know if it's been looked at. I should probably go look at that to see. Will inflammation inherently prevent muscle gain? Well, I mean, we know that exercise helps to improve the inflammatory profile. I think you'd need to look at that. I mean, there's lots of papers, but is that through weight loss? I mean, I guess what I'd have to ask in terms of what Greg and Eric, who I think very highly of, what they were looking at. Like, again, I'm not sure why they were looking at muscle gain in collegiate football players. And again, you do have the drug issue. I think it's a big player in that. We also know, I mean, as far as the dirty bulk, at least 2 studies, Garth and the more recent one, beyond a certain calorie intake, which is
Ribeiro.
Is that the one that just came out? Yeah,
It didn't just come out, but it was way more recent.
fairly recent. Garth
It,
was several years ago.
yeah, and
Yeah, and like high
Ribeiro was a
calorie intake of
ton, and it was in
ton of
actual
calories.
bodybuilders.
Yeah, and it was like 1,000 extra calories. It was
Yeah,
something nuts. And yeah, they gained a little bit more muscle and they gained a ton of body fat, which isn't really relevant to this. That's really a calorie surplus thing. Will being at a higher body fat percentage will that cause you to gain less muscle compared to if you were leaner? I don't know. I'd have to go actually look at the research. I'm going to just say, like I said, I think I have always kind of advocated that, yeah, I think bodybuilders and athletes should probably stay leaner. And I was always coming from the insulin resistance perspective, and maybe the training overcomes that. I'm willing, I need to go look, quite honestly. So I can't say I have a strong opinion on it. Will the inflammation, Menno's standpoint? Maybe. Do I think the research he's citing is any good? No, but that's nothing new. Do I think on collegiate football players is a whole lot better? Remember having someone throw at me, oh, FFMI over 25, because there's this study on some elite athletes who goes, yeah, we're clean. Sure, cool story, bro. Yeah, I believe you that an elite thrower is not on drugs. And this is the data you're going to bring to me? Sure. And the individual in question, who I'll not be as petty, I'm like, really? You haven't gotten past the 25 FFMI and you're a genetically superior bodybuilder. So don't throw this paper at me on collegiate drug use. Football is huge. And I think that'll change the equation completely. Go, one of my favorite pictures is the one of Lee Priest. The bulk rip, man. In 12 weeks, he went from, fatty McFatty fats to ripped, because when you have all the drugs, it changes the equation completely. I think from a more practical standpoint, if you're going to, and I think this was something discussed, in the bulking roundtable, which I didn't listen to. It's like, look, if you're a bodybuilder, even if you're gonna get big, going GFH, the fat has to come off eventually. And the more fat you're carrying, the longer it takes, right? I'm a big believer, even from just a practical standpoint, stay in that 10 to 15. I know some people go up to 20, whatever. Whatever. We're picking mids here. Gain till you hit a certain body fat percentage, lean back out, gain back, because eventually the fat has to come. I mean, GFH is fun. Don't make any mistake about it. But, and I think if you're at a higher body fat percentage, well, assuming you do want to bodybuild and lean out eventually, man, if you gain fat from 25, 30%, you want to get to 15, you're going to diet forever. So I don't know if I have a strong opinion on whether or not the P ratio holds when you add heavy resistance training. I don't know. And I don't know, and I don't even know how you test it. I mean, I think it would be a better data set. Go look at, the body fat percentages of some of the people in these training studies where they're actually aiming for hypertrophy. But you have to get the individual data, and they always give you the averages, and they're so across the board. My favorite new one, without getting into it, the new diet break study. I was like, diet breaks don't work. Dude, go look at the raw data. The body fat percentage ranges from 6% to 35%. The lean body mass, there's a 20 kilo difference between subjects. The leptin levels range from 0 to 10,000, 4 orders of magnitude. You're telling me you're gonna use the exact same diet break protocol, and why they did 3-1 is still beyond me. Derek Helms is on that paper. I know that's not how he programs them. And you're going to do that across a body fat range of 6-fold and tell me, come on. But yeah, so when you're looking, you get these average body fat, it's like, 17 to 35%. You'd have to pull the individual data. And again, I'm not convinced that a collegiate, can I get those references somewhere? Is there somewhere easy I can find without having to listen to a podcast I'm almost set through? There'll be a transcript somewhere, but I don't know that comparing different positions, they have different goals. A cornerback is not trying to get as big as possible. So the fact that he's leaner, I don't know. I don't know. So I don't have a strong opinion one way or the other without looking. Certainly whatever I wrote 23 years ago, there is some truth to it. There's clearly a genetic component, but that's within any individual. I think it can be hard to separate that from an inherent biology of P ratio. I think there's certainly something going on. Certainly on the way down there is.
Hmm.
You can diet overweight individuals and it doesn't matter. They don't lose a lot of muscle. And if you do the same thing with a lean individual, you don't even have to resistance train the over fat individual and they'll lose mostly fat at the leaner levels. Clearly. So it's clearly working in one direction. Does it prevent muscle gain at a higher body fat? I'd still diet for practical reasons, which is just me evading the question.
Yeah, I think practically is probably the most important consideration in this equation. In the context of a physique athlete, when is the next time you're going to compete?
Sure.
How much weight are you going to need to lose? How long is that contest prep diet going to be? That's probably the most important consideration in all of this.
And I would even add, like, yes, and I don't know if their target was specifically physique athletes. Because
Hmm.
yeah, eventually you got to diet, and diets are
Yeah.
long enough as it is. If you're starting, it's a 6-month diet to get from 15 to 5. Are you going to diet for a year and a half because GFH'd? But even for the general public, right? Most of us, the folks that get into bodybuilding at 24, they want to go look good on the beach, man. They don't want to be walking around at 25%. Now, if you're a power lifter, don't, super heavyweight, don't care. Even power lifters can only get, you got to cut it off at some point. For athletes, and I think this was something that came up in the bulking roundtable as far as, how many calories, like if you're a performance athlete, you cannot get too fat during the year. You just can't, because that will impair your training so massively, having to carry it around. They stay, but their rate of muscle gain is also, it's career long. It is, they are gaining that from the time they're 15, developing over a decade. They're not trying to maximize muscle growth. Because it's all happening at a very slow rate. Powerlifters may do a dedicated hypertrophy phase, but if you're in a heavier weight class, body fat doesn't matter. I did a consult last year, and the lifter was like, "Yeah, I got too fat in my off season. I'm trying to make," and I'm like, "You're gonna suffer. I can get you there, but you're gonna suffer," because she gained way too much body fat in the off season. So yeah, if we're focusing just on the biology, because even in obese individuals, I would have to ask, did they just give them more protein? Because that's what they do in older folks. We gave them more protein. We saw impaired response. Okay. Add training. Training is always the single most important factor to alter muscular physiology, to improve nutrient uptake, to improve local insulin sensitivity. I even said that when I was talking about that years ago, like, can you gain muscle while you lose fat? And I go, well, in over fat beginners, it's real easy, because we start with a system that is full body insulin resistant. Even the fat cells, right? Fat cells become insulin resistant last. They're trying to actively push calories away. That's why it sits in the bloodstream. Now you start training and you're a beginner. Resistance training is improving insulin sensitivity locally to the skeletal muscle, because that would be the theoretical ideal. Fat cells insulin resistant, skeletal muscle insulin sensitive. Guess what? That's what clenbuterol does. It's a reason it's a great partitioning. Same with growth hormone. It's a reason those are great partitioning. So they start, and initially they're improving insulin sensitivity in the muscle because they're depleting calories. Carbs and fat can start coming in. They're stimulating protein synthesis from a noob stage, and they're going to be able to grow, while their fat cells are going, get the calories away. And what you see, what it looks like, is the fat just goes away and gets burned, stored, or used for energy or whatever. Does it happen in lean trained individuals? Absolutely not. There was a paper last year in Strength and Conditioning Journal. It was about, did you read this one about, can you gain muscle and lose fat at the same time?
Oh yeah, Chris Bearcat was on that, right? The body recomposition paper.
Yeah, and the same guy who wrote the fasted cardio paper I looked at.
Guillermo Escalante.
Yeah, thank you.
Mm.
You know what? I used to have a memory like you. I did. I remember papers from the 90s that I read. I don't remember anything now. Getting old sucks, guys. Don't do it. So you look, but I read their paper because I'm like, all right, let's see what, because they looked at this huge data set, like 22 papers where it happened. Now, some of the results were absurd. One of the Cribs studies, Cribs was big in EAS back in the day. Over 8 weeks, they gained 5 kilos of lean body mass and lost 5 kilos of fat. I believe you. No, I truly, that was just the magic of creatine. I believe you guys. So they looked at all these studies, and they were like, most of them did show, yeah, they lost fat and gained muscle. And I was able to pull like 19 of them, a couple I couldn't get. They were all invariably in performance sports, body fat percentage, even in the men, was in the 20s. There was not a lean individual among them. So then they had 4 studies on lean bodybuilders. Not a single one of them pulled it off. Not a single, or one lost a little muscle, one had no difference. One was a terrible case study where they hemorrhaged muscle. It was like, yeah, you're over fat and you're not, these aren't trained bodybuilders. These are basketball players. Even in the Garth paper, the slow and fast weight loss people love to cite, they're like, oh, with the slow weight, they gained muscle. The women only, in their arms only, because they were in sports that they weren't training them, and their body fat was like 28%. Their arms were effectively over fat newbie. So I'm not that impressed by this. And the lean bodybuilders didn't happen, because when you're lean and trained, it doesn't. Whether it's, which I don't know why, oh, we're talking about overfat. So yeah, if you take an overfat individual and feed them protein, maybe it doesn't. But if you had resistance training, even to older individuals, I suspect it reverses that. I suspect in some way, I'd have to look at the data. So I don't find taking an overfat inactive individual and drawing a conclusion to a trained overfat individual, I don't find that convincing, but that's par for the course for that individual. So yeah, I'd have to go look. And yeah, I think absolutely it would be interesting to have some better data on this, especially to separate out what is invariably a steroid issue. We know that at collegiate football players, there is a huge drug culture, and I'm willing to bet you that changes all of it, because steroids are awesome.
I haven't heard anyone make that point, so I really appreciate you bringing
People
that
don't
to
like
the
to make,
discussion.
people don't like to bring
I
up
know
that
they
point.
don't, huh?
But you can't dismiss the role of that when you're looking at high-level athletes
Yeah.
in any sport. It is just the nature of the beast. Now go find some college students and get them in different body fat percentages, put them on the same training and get them to do take a protein drink, maybe not from Dymatize, or if it is from Dymatize, someone needs to declare their conflict of interest a little more transparently and see what happens. Because I'm willing to be wrong, absolutely. If that's what the data says, I think it should be studied. I think it'd be interesting, but nobody cares about bodybuilders. Even the Garth paper was in athletes, and at least they got elite athletes, which we might see there's a drug issue too, but that was it the Fieri paper? But wasn't it like 1,000? It was some crazy calorie intake. And it was only like 4 weeks, right?
Right.
It was something, and they gained, it was kilos, right? Wasn't it like 4 or 5 pounds of fat in 4 weeks? It was something utterly dumb. You're probably pulling it up too.
I think the low calorie group was consuming like 4,000 plus calories, and the high calorie group was consuming like 6,000 calories. I swear the high calorie group was consuming like 1,000 grams of carbs per day.
It was something nuts like that. It was just absolutely, because like 4,000,
like 800 to 1,000.
Yeah, 4,000 could be maintenance for a big guy training a lot, but 2,000 and over that short of a period, and the fat gain was just staggering. Yeah. What that gets more into the calorie level per se, rather than the underlying physiology. So yeah, I'd like to see more data on it. At this point, I'm willing to go. I think it certainly works for dieting. Like I said, I think there's no debate about that. But will it impair muscle mass gain? No, and if not, fat is the source of happiness. Fat is the source of strength. Saying that, nobody believes me. Like, no, trust me, you'll be happier. You'll definitely be stronger.
So in the context of gaining, in the absence of resistance training, it definitely seems like there are some adverse physiological consequences to increasing your body fat, which may theoretically impede your ability to make muscular gains. But the ultimate question left here is, how powerful is resistance training? Can it overcome these physiological consequences? With that being said, Lyle, I don't know if you want to go on the record here, putting a line in the sand, but if I were to put forth to you, and after I said it, you can say, no, I'm not answering this. But if I were to put forth to you, we have a natural bodybuilder. He is in an extended off season. He might not be stepping on stage for 5 years, and he wants to maximize his muscular potential. Would you say that his gains could be compromised if he were to, say, spend a majority of his off season in the 20% body fat plus range? So would his gains be compromised by being at a pretty high body fat throughout the offseason in comparison to perhaps running a more frequent mini cuts and staying closer in the 12 to 15% range for most of it? Would he make better quote unquote lean gains in the latter scenario?
Before I answer that, I'm going to tell you how to win the Mr. Olympia, because this goes back to the overfeeding stuff. In overfeeding studies, even in inactive people, about 1/3 of the total weight gained is lean body mass. It actually stops holding at higher body fat percentages. Just bear with me, being ridiculous. Here's the key. You bulk to 900 pounds. You should have 300 pounds of lean body mass. Diet back down without losing muscle and win the Olympia. That's my advice for today. How to win the Olympia without training. You don't remember the ABCDE diet, but we're not getting into that. The 90s were awesome. I don't know. I truly don't. I truly don't know if resistance training, and even that, at 20, 25%, then we could even have a big debate. How are you even measuring it, right? Because even there, let's think about this. My 15% value came from old methods. DEXA would put someone at 21%. Now, how does that change all this? Because I sure as hell don't know anymore, because I don't know why DEXA is giving such systematically different values. Maybe the answer's out there, but I don't know if it's measuring essential fat. I don't know why. But when you've got contest-ready bodybuilders DEXAing out at 9%, and I know there are folks out there that even who set a body fat cutoff go, yeah, if you're a male, stay at 20.
Mm-hmm.
Not 15's too low, because it takes too much work to stay there. Well, 20% via DEXA is 15 via calipers, and the hell if I know. I just truly don't. I would have to look and see if anything's been done to show that regular resistance training will improve skeletal muscle insulin sensitivity in the absence of fat loss. And until I do that, I don't have an answer. So maybe. How's that for a useless answer?
So basically what we're left with here is just practical concerns. If you're a physique athlete, when do you plan on competing next? If you're the average gym rat, what body fat percentage makes you happy? What body fat percentage is low enough to sustain, where you're not hungry all the time? It doesn't take a dramatic amount of effort to stay there. How is your training performance and recovery? You don't want to be too fat, whereas you mentioned where you can't even complete the average bodybuilding training session because your work capacity is so poor. So basically, we're just left here with kind of figure out what works best for you, what makes you happy, what feels good.
And you also don't want to be too lean, because not only are hormones going to be severely impacted, but you have to keep your calories. The idea of lean gaining, in the sense of I'm going to stay 8% and gain significant muscle, that doesn't work. It just doesn't. So there is some happy medium. I do two interesting data points. One, right, because I was throwing around 12 to 15%. Somebody did, it was one of those studies where we showed people pictures of a bunch of different body types to get an what do they like the most, right? In men, it's the hip to waist ratio, but it was for men to show women. And what they found was that women had a unconscious preference for men that were in the 12 to 15% body range, 12 to 15% body fat range. And that's because that's where they were the healthiest. That's where their immune system function was best. Their hormones were optimized. So that has no relevance to this other than it's a paper I remember. And since anecdotes are now officially accepted in evidence-based literature, I'm going to play that card for years. And I dismissed this. Bodybuilders felt that they got their best gains at about 12% body fat. So there you go. Bro science wins. Guys that are bigger than any of us said 12% was best. So, okay, I'm joking, but and it was funny when I was younger and really, I was just like, they're just making an excuse to stay fat, because 12% is so fat for a male. But that idea has been out there, but yeah, I think it would be interesting to see it studied more directly rather than sort of a post hoc analysis of the data set. Yeah, I'd be curious to know, because it would certainly make life a lot easier. But yeah, practically, does it matter? Is anyone gonna, and we might even tie it in with the first part, and then we'll end this. You can only train consistently for so long before you need a break if you're training hard, right? So do you need to stay in a perma bulk? Do you need to just maybe just whatever, maybe not worry about it too much? Because even if you're that guy, well, and we might ask, okay, is he gaining the theoretical? Let's say he's at 25%. Is he gaining fat, or is he just staying there and gaining slowly enough that fat gain is not that excessive? Because if he's gaining and he hits 30, 35%, he's going to be dieting for the next 5 years to get back into shape. And that may be fine. If I, whatever, fat cell hyperplasia, you can make new fat cells, guys. I got bad news. Maybe is he just staying in that range because it lets him eat enough and recover well? Yeah, I guess. I mean, I don't know. Maybe. It's the best I can do until some data comes out, and I'll be curious either way.